Roger Williams was born in 1603 in England. Roger and his family sailed over to Boston, Massachusetts in 1631 at the age of 28. When he arrived, it didn't take long for him to grow discontent with the leaders at the Massachusetts Bay Colony, though it should be noted that Williams was not just another troublemaker in the colony. He became friends with the likes of John Winthrop, Thomas Hooker, and became very close friends with William Bradford. And though there are those who would like to say that Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson fought for more freedom because they became enlightened outside of the bounds of church and religion, that is also false. Williams thought that the church was corrupted and needed to sever its ties with the Anglican church. And well, Anne, she was just crazy, but more on that later. Williams was known as an Anabaptist for some time, and then even renounced that, and wanted to merely be known as a seeker. He would berate the churches both at Massachusetts Bay and Plymouth for not severing its ties with the English church, and the magistrates and the leaders of both colonies kept telling him to shut his mouth because the things that he said were coming dangerously close to treason against the king and England. Williams believed that the church and the state should be utterly separate. As we have seen in the previous two colonies, there were people that were being elected to office, and only those who were part of the church could be elected, let alone vote. Though his reasoning for wanting the church and the state to be separated was not due to a desire for religious liberty, but rather because he thought that the state and the government would corrupt the pure doctrine of Jesus Christ and the church. I want to point out that many of these early forefathers were not political geniuses. Rather, they were just merely men who were trying to stand on their own convictions to protect the Bible, the church, and the doctrine of Jesus Christ. And what was created out of that mindset was not only religious liberty, but many of the liberties and freedoms that we would all eventually enjoy. It's very likely that many of the men of these two colonies had actually agreed with Williams on his points, but the colonies had recently received a charter from the Royal Navy threatening to seize the charters and to take over the companies. Though the colonies would never have known that King Charles I was what he was dealing with back in England, and that he would actually never get around to dealing with those colonies because he had much bigger fish to fry. And that big fish that he would have to fry was Oliver Cromwell, but more on that in a different video. The reason I say that there were people who were fine and even agreed with what Williams was saying is in fact that he wasn't driven out immediately. He was given 6 weeks, and he stayed even longer. Ben Hart gives wonderful insight here in this area. The General Court argued with Williams at length and even brought in Thomas Hooker to reason with him. They gave Williams ample time to change his views, or at least to agree to temper his most extreme rhetoric. But as the process continued, his stance grew more intractable. He denounced as hypocrites several respected leaders. The General Court, feeling there was little choice, ordered him expelled. Williams was given 6 weeks to leave, much to the sadness of William Bradford, with whom he would correspond with the rest of his life. Williams wound up staying much longer than 6 weeks, but was finally told that if he did not depart soon, that he would be shipped off to England. In January 1636, he and 5 of his followers bought from the Indians a plot of land at Narragansett Bay and founded Providence. Rhode Island did become a haven for various dissident Christian denominations, mostly because Williams was not a political genius or even remotely interested in building a political community. Rather, what he wanted was a place where all could worship according to conscience. In other words, according to how you felt God was leading you to worship him. The one thing that I would primarily disagree with Williams in is the fact that he thought that all human institutions were corrupt and must therefore be avoided. It was this belief that he carried, and still some Christians even carry today, of the thought of that we must avoid all human institutions or even becoming involved in politics and government. However, I must ask this question, that if we were to completely remove ourselves from the equation, who would stand up for the same principles that we believe in? I feel as though our country and our government would erode even quicker if we were to follow the same route that Williams wanted. So the road to the separation of church and state was actually ultimately paved by Winthrop and by Hooker and their experiments, if you will, in Massachusetts. They helped put the future country on the road to a Republican constitutional democracy, as they broadened the political franchise and loosened the standards for church membership as time had passed. This was something that Rogers would have never been able to accomplish, since he was so extreme in his views and thinking that it was better to completely have a government devoid of all Christian influence. He was uninterested in civil affairs, and he absolutely shunned society. However, I will say this to his credit, that due to his obstinance to society and the ideals on the separation of church and state, which heavily influenced the culture, if you will, of Rhode Island, since it was home to many people of peculiar ways of worshiping God that were honestly seen as being heretical by others. This type of ideology was prevalent in Rhode Island, and later on in 1787, Rhode Island refused to ratify the federal constitution until some amendments were added, including the freedom of religion. And finally, on May 29, 1790, Rhode Island ratified the federal constitution and officially became the 13th state of the Union. And to think that our freedom of religion came from a bunch of people who would have been known as a bunch of crazy weirdos living in the tiny territory of Rhode Island. Anne Hutchinson was a very interesting woman. She found herself wrapped up in controversy when she launched a campaign against the minister in Boston, Massachusetts by the name of John Wilson. She despised him because she thought that he was a boring preacher. Oh boy, could you imagine that happening nowadays? How many preachers would be on the chopping block for that? I'm just asking. I'm just kidding around. But anyway, according to Anne, there were only 2 sealed or perhaps saved, if you want to put it that way, or true preachers in all of Massachusetts. It was John Cotton and her brother-in-law, John Wheelwright. And I promise she's not biased at all. Ben Hart again gives some wonderful insight into this whole situation. According to her count, there were only 2 Christian sealed preachers in all of Massachusetts. They were John Cotton, whom she called the voice of the beloved, and her brother-in-law, John Wheelwright. The rest were hypocrites, liars, and on their way to perdition. But she singled out Wilson, no one exactly knows why, as especially pernicious. One day, she caused the scene by abruptly leaving a Boston meeting after it turned out that John Wilson was preaching when she expected it to be John Cotton. Now I have to point out, much like Ben Hart does, whom I will quote in just a bit, that such an action like this was crazy for a woman to do back in this time period. Women did not enjoy all the freedoms that they do today, and in my opinion, had she done this anywhere else in the world, I think it would have ended horribly wrong for her. Though in this case, it did end horribly wrong for her, but just not by the hands of the Christians living in the New World. To me, it just goes to show how these people were living on the cutting edge of societal evolution, and that the Pilgrims were on this evolutionary path, if you will, prior to all of our freedoms that we are able to enjoy today. All right, let's go on. And ladies, don't get mad at the messenger of what's about to be said. Again, they were making strides to the mindset that we have today, but they were far from perfect. For a woman in the 17th century to be launching such an invective against a prominent member of the community was unheard of. John Winthrop tried to defend her behavior on the grounds that women must be given more latitude because of their weaker intellects. But even the Bay leadership was inclined to make allowances for female troubles. It was thought that Hutchinson had gone beyond the pale. She seemed to be passing judgment on others, which the Bible says is the sole prerogative of the Lord. The general court convened to investigate her behavior and asked who she thought had given her the authority to decide whether John Wilson or anyone else was sealed or not. Anne answered that she had been given an immediate revelation from God and that the voice of his own spirit had spoken to her soul. Well, that answer completely just sealed her fate. She was treading dangerously close to the beliefs that the Quakers, or of the Quakers, who during this time period, by the way, were religious outcasts in 3 of the major colonies, Virginia, Connecticut, and Massachusetts. The general court ruled her to be a dangerous heretic, and she was banished from the colony. She was deemed a woman not fit for society. She moved to Rhode Island for a little while, but it wasn't long before she thought, just like Massachusetts, that it didn't live up to her Christian standards. She then moved out to Long Island, where she was eventually killed by the Indians there. I wanted to add Anne Hutchinson here because her story shines a light on a few things. First, that this wasn't a religious persecution of a woman with ideas. It was just a crazy lady who judged people and was eventually removed for her own radical religious ideology. And I must add here that it wasn't just because she was a woman. The colonies had removed many Quakers as well because they believed in being guided by their inner light. Both women and men were banished for being Quaker. And the last thing I want to point out is that she was tolerated for quite a while as well. For a woman to hold this kind of campaign against men, that was just unheard of during this time period. Remember, it's really, really easy for us to look back and in disgust or even judgment based on the standards and the freedoms that we enjoy today. But back then, the leniency that was granted to her was almost unheard of. Many people today would think that these people were backwards for not implementing women's rights earlier. But we have to keep in mind that this was a counterculture stance and that the march toward change takes time, patience, and repeated effort from generation to generation. This was an advancement that Christianity helped facilitate that would eventually lead to the full rights and freedoms that women would enjoy today. But, as always, you let me know what you think down in the comments below, and I'll catch you guys in the next video. So, no, really, let me know. Do you think I'm right? Do you think I'm wrong? Do you have your own opinion on that? So, yeah, seriously, let me know, and I love to engage with you guys down in the comment section below. But I'll catch you guys later at the end of May. Have a good one. Fear not, dear viewer, for I, your host, have not forgotten about your bi-weekly Joe Biden fix. I will give it to you, so here we go.
Young black kids growing up in the Bronx who don't even know what the word a computer is. They don't know. They don't know these things. And I want the world open up to all of them because...
Oops, my apologies. The wrong clip won't... I'll try not to let it happen again. Here's the real one I wanted you to watch.
And by the way, you know, I sit on the stand, and it get hot. I got hairy legs that turn blonde in the sun. And the kids used to come up and reach in the pool and rub my leg down so it was straight, and then watch the hair come back up again. They'd look at it. So I learned about roaches. I learned about kids jumping on my lap. And I've loved kids jumping on my lap.
I bet you do, Joe Biden. I bet you do. I'll catch you guys in the next video.